February 3rd, 1944, or 5:17 a.m., Churchill, Manitoba. The northern sky was still blue-black, the kind of darkness that freezes sound itself. Sergeant Douglas Kerr pressed his gloved hands against the frost-rimmed window of the Quonset hut, watching his breath bloom into a thin cloud that disappeared almost instantly. Outside, the temperature hovered near -40. Beyond the fence, the Hudson Bay was a solid sheet of ice stretching toward an invisible horizon. Inside the wooden barracks, light bulbs buzzed weakly above benches crowded with test tubes, rusted saws, and blocks of translucent ice sweating under the heat of a single iron stove. The men called it the lab, though it was more a shed stitched together by desperation and secrecy. Kerr was not a scientist. He was a mechanic from Winnipeg, reassigned here after an engine failure grounded his bomber. But his hands had built engines, patched leaks, and now, under orders from an eccentric British officer named Geoffrey Pyke, they were building something stranger than any weapon he'd known. The men said it could change the war. They whispered that it could float, survive gunfire, and stay colder than death itself. They called it Project Habbakuk. At the far end of the room, Pyke paced like a restless wolf, his breath rising in sharp bursts of steam. He spoke in riddles, quoting scripture, muttering about ice that could not melt. He carried notebooks stained with grease and coffee, filled with equations and sketches of monstrous ships. "You can't stop a bullet with steel if you can freeze the sea itself," he'd said once, almost to himself. The others had laughed quietly, thinking he was mad. But madness had become the currency of innovation. The Allies were losing men faster than ideas could save them. The first experiment began at dawn. Kerr and the others dragged a block of frozen water, mixed with sawdust by Pyke's command, onto a metal platform. They called it Pykerete. The concept was absurd, a composite of ice and wood pulp that somehow was harder than concrete and nearly unsinkable. Kerr watched as Pyke raised his pistol and fired. The echo cracked through the cold air. Instead of shattering, the block only dented slightly. The bullet ricocheted, embedding itself in a wall of snow. A few men cheered. One cursed as the ricochet grazed his leg. Pyke smiled thinly. "Gentlemen," he said, lowering the gun, "nature just handed us her own armor." For weeks they worked in silence, broken only by the groaning of ice under pressure. They carved and tested, hauling new blocks from the shore each morning. The temperature inside the lab never rose above freezing. Even the tools froze to their fingers if held too long. Kerr's eyelashes were crusted with frost. His fingertips cracked and bled inside his gloves. But he stayed. He had seen bombers fall like black crosses over Europe. He'd seen men turn to ash. Here at least there was creation. Cold, but creation. Each night when the kerosene lamps dimmed, he listened to the wind tear across the tundra. It sounded like the sea in pain. Beyond the fence, polar bears roamed the frozen shoreline, drawn by the smell of food and fuel. The guards fired warning shots into the dark. The ice shuddered underfoot. Kerr wondered if the world itself could break from so much pressure. By mid-February, the first model of the floating fortress was ready for testing. A massive slab of reinforced pykerete, 20 feet long and 6 feet thick. They lowered it into a half-frozen lake nearby using pulleys that screamed under the weight. The structure floated, ghostly and motionless, steam curling off its edges as the morning sun struck it. The men applauded. Pyke said nothing. He only stared, his eyes sunken, his beard rimed with frost. Rumors spread quickly through the base. The British Admiralty had visited once, wrapped in fur coats, their boots crunching on the ice as they surveyed the experiment. Some said the Americans were watching too, eager to see if Canada could build a ship made of frozen wood pulp strong enough to survive the Atlantic. Others whispered that Pyke's idea had been dismissed in London as lunacy, that Churchill himself had once backed it but now wanted results. Or silence. The days grew shorter. The light faded into endless twilight, and the cold became a kind of presence, an invisible commander that dictated their movements. The generators struggled to stay alive, their fuel thickening like syrup in the tanks. When one engine seized in the night, Kerr spent 4 hours outside with a wrench clenched between numb fingers, praying to any god that the metal wouldn't snap. He began to notice the silence, not the absence of sound, but a suffocating stillness that pressed against his chest when the wind stopped. It was as if the cold itself was listening. Once, while alone testing a new sample, he heard the ice groan beneath him, a deep, mournful sound that seemed to come from within the earth. He froze, the hair on his neck rising. The noise came again, a slow twisting crack that echoed like distant artillery. He knelt, pressing his ear against the ice, and thought he could hear water moving below, as if something alive were trapped inside. When spring came, if it could be called spring, Pyke's health began to fail. His fingers were blue, his speech erratic. He spoke of dreams in which the sea itself rose to swallow the ships of men. "They won't see it," he told Kerr one morning, his voice barely audible. "They'll think it's madness, but madness is just foresight that's come too soon." He collapsed later that week and was flown south. The project continued without him, but the soul had gone out of it. By April, cracks appeared in the prototype, tiny at first, like veins in marble, then larger. The cold that had preserved their creation began to betray it. The engines that kept the ice chilled ran out of fuel. The structure began to weep under the weak northern sun. Kerr stood on the edge of the lake and watched as months of work dissolved into the gray water, the surface swallowing the fortress in slow, shuddering gulps. No one spoke. They simply watched the weapon that might have changed the world return to what it had always been: water, sawdust, and belief. When the telegram came weeks later, it carried no ceremony. The project had been deprioritized due to impractical material constraints. Kerr folded the paper and placed it inside his coat. That night he walked out onto the frozen bay, alone. The stars above shimmered like shards of broken glass. The wind sliced through his parka, and his boots cracked the thin crust of snow with each step. He stopped, knelt, and touched the ice. It burned his palm with a purity that steel could never match. Years later, when people spoke of the great inventions of the war, the radar, the jet engine, the atomic bomb, no one mentioned the frozen ship. No one spoke of the men who lived in that secret lab by the bay, or of the dreams that melted before the world was ready. But in the archives, in the margins of forgotten reports, the name Project Habbakuk still appears, faint and misspelled, like a ghost resurfacing through ice. And if you listen closely, on nights when the wind sweeps across the Hudson and the temperature falls low enough to freeze memory itself, some say you can still hear the groaning of that impossible vessel, half science, half faith, drifting beneath the coldest silence ever engineered by man. March 1944. The Hudson Bay lay buried beneath a white silence that could shatter bone. The wind no longer howled. It whispered, dry and granular, carrying flecks of frozen salt that scoured everything they touched. Inside the half-collapsed Quonset hut, Sergeant Douglas Kerr lit a cigarette he couldn't taste. The flame barely caught. The match went out before the first pull of smoke reached his lungs. It didn't matter. Nothing burned properly here. Not fire, not hope, not even time. After Pyke's evacuation, leadership of the project fell to Captain Hensley, a practical man from Montreal who despised mystery. To him, the experiment was no longer a dream, but a checklist. He arrived with typed orders, schedules, and an expression so cold it might have been carved from the bay itself. "Gentlemen," he'd said, stepping through the doorway on his first morning, "you're not building an idea anymore. You're building a prototype. Let's make something that floats before the spring thaw does our job for us." The men obeyed, though the spark that once drove them had dimmed. The mornings were mechanical. They rose at 600, scraped frost from their boots, swallowed oatmeal stiff as concrete, and returned to their stations. They cut new ice, mixed sawdust, stirred slurry in barrels with wooden paddles. The sound was hypnotic, an endless rhythm of scraping, mixing, freezing, hammering. Kerr sometimes thought it resembled a heartbeat trapped inside the ice itself, slow and stubborn. He began to write in a small notebook he kept beneath his pillow, careful never to let the officers see. Most entries were short observations, the way frost grew upward on the nails driven into the walls, or how the metal spoons froze to their lips during breakfast. But sometimes, when the wind was mercifully still, he allowed himself to write about Pyke, about the strange glimmer in the man's eyes when he spoke of living ice, about how he believed that science was not invention, but confession, that man merely rediscovered what nature had already built and hidden. He thought the cold could think. Kerr wrote once, he thought we could build something alive. The second prototype was larger, thicker, and built directly on the lake. They called it the Ark, half in jest, half in reverence. Its ribs were beams of spruce scavenged from an abandoned railway depot. Over them, they poured layer after layer of pykrete, freezing it solid with portable refrigeration units stolen from the naval yard. The process was slow, brutal. Frostbite claimed fingertips, ears, and patches of skin. One man, Corporal Reeve, lost half his right foot after falling into a fissure. The medics said he was lucky. Reeve disagreed. They flew him out 2 days later, and his bunk stayed empty, like a silence no one dared fill. As the weeks bled together, the line between discipline and delirium blurred. The temperature never rose above 25 /16, even in daylight. Conversations grew shorter, words forming clouds that vanished before they could finish a thought. Kerr sometimes found himself staring at his own breath, as if it were a separate being escaping from him. When sleep came, it came shallow and colorless. He dreamt of ships made of glass, of oceans freezing mid-wave, of Pyke standing on a deck of ice that stretched to eternity, calling for him in a language the wind swallowed whole. By late March, the Ark stood 20 meters long, towering above the men like a frozen cathedral. Its walls shimmered faintly under the lamps, marbled with veins of pale wood. Hensley inspected it each morning, clipboard in hand, muttering calculations that meant little to those who had to touch the thing. He wanted it ready for inspection by April 10th. That gave them 16 days to make it indestructible. They worked in 12-hour shifts. Tools froze to their gloves. Hammers shattered like glass. Once a generator exploded when the oil inside turned to sludge. The fire burned blue for a moment before being smothered by the wind. The smell of scorched rubber lingered for days, merging with the omnipresent reek of kerosene and sweat. Kerr noticed how the ice changed with each passing day. It no longer looked dead. Beneath the surface, air bubbles pulsed faintly, sliding between layers of wood fiber as if breathing. Sometimes faint cracks spread across the surface overnight, only to heal themselves by morning when the temperature dropped again. "It's alive," one of the men whispered once, and no one laughed. They all felt it. The hum, the low resonance that shivered through the ground when they struck it with a hammer. It was as though the ice remembered the sea it came from. The night before the inspection, a storm rolled in from the Arctic. Snow fell sideways, fine as dust, filling every crevice and gap. The men stayed inside, packed shoulder to shoulder around the stove, listening to the structure groan under the wind's assault. Kerr sat awake, staring at the wall, his thoughts heavy. He wondered what Pyke would have said. Perhaps that the storm was nature's applause or its warning. At dawn, the blizzard had passed. The world outside was blank, luminous. The Ark stood unharmed, encased in a crust of new frost that glittered like silver. Hensley arrived with a group of officers in fur coats. Their breath smoked in unison as they approached the lake. Kerr and the remaining men lined up, their faces raw with cold and anticipation. Hensley ordered a test. They placed a small explosive charge against the side of the structure, less than a pound of TNT. The men backed away. The detonation cracked the silence like a whip. A geyser of snow erupted and then nothing. When the smoke cleared, the Ark still stood. The surface bore only a shallow crater, already beginning to frost over again. One of the officers removed his glove and touched it. "Still cold," he muttered. Another nodded. "Too cold to die." For the first time in weeks, Kerr saw Hensley smile. It wasn't joy. It was calculation. "Gentlemen," he said to the visiting officers, "you're looking at the hull of the future." But that future never came. The Admiralty telegram arrived 3 days later, curt and absolute. Project Habbakuk suspended indefinitely. Further investment deemed impractical under current conditions. No explanation, no farewell, just a command to cease operations immediately and dismantle all equipment for reassignment. The words froze the air more completely than the weather ever could. Hensley folded the paper without emotion. "Orders are orders," he said simply, and walked out. The next morning, the men began disassembly. They broke apart the refrigeration units, packed the instruments, and stripped the huts. Kerr volunteered for the last duty, sinking the Ark. It took them hours to drill through its base with heated rods. The ice hissed and steamed like an animal protesting its death. As the holes deepened, water began to seep through, freezing almost instantly before breaking open again. When the final blow came, the sound was not an explosion, but a sigh. The Ark cracked through the middle, tilted, and slowly sank into the dark water below, disappearing beneath thin plumes of mist. For a long time, no one moved. The lake was still. Only the faint hiss of melting ice remained. That night, Kerr packed his things. He took Pyke's old notebook from a shelf, left there like a relic no one dared touch. Inside, on the last page, written in cramped pencil, were the words, "When men forget how to dream, even ice will burn." He tore the page out, folded it carefully, and slid it into his pocket. He left the base before dawn, catching the supply train south. Through the frost-covered window, he watched the horizon stretch endlessly, a white, indifferent graveyard of experiments and ambition. Somewhere behind him, the bay was already sealing over, reclaiming what the war had briefly borrowed. Kerr would never return to Churchill. Years later, when he read in a London newspaper that Geoffrey Pyke had been found dead in a hotel room, the news barely surprised him. The article mentioned nothing of Habbakuk, only that Pyke had been a visionary thinker. Kerr folded the paper, stared at the window, and saw the reflection of the ice again. The same glacial calm, the same silence. He realized then that Pyke had been right about one thing. Some inventions don't disappear. They simply go dormant, buried under the snow, waiting for another desperate winter to wake them. 1952, London. The war was long over, but in the archives beneath Whitehall, the cold still lingered. The basement air smelled of iron, dust, and damp paper, a mausoleum for ideas that never lived long enough to be recognized. Sergeant Douglas Kerr, now a civilian clerk with thinning hair and a limp he carried from years of frostbite, walked those corridors every morning without speaking to anyone. His job was simple: catalog declassified wartime projects for permanent storage or destruction. The irony was not lost on him. The man who had once built a ship of ice now spent his days burning the dreams of others. He found the file on a gray Tuesday, buried inside a box marked Miscellaneous, Canadian Operations, 1943-44. The handwriting on the tag was unfamiliar. The ink faded to a ghostly brown. Kerr opened it carefully. Inside were reports stamped secret, blueprints smeared with oil, and a photograph of men standing beside a gleaming slab of ice under a flag that no longer flew. He didn't need the label to know. It was Habbakuk. The photograph brought back the smell of kerosene, the burn of wind against skin, the way the cold hummed through bone. He stared at the faces, young, bearded, weary. There was Pyke at the center, his expression half mad, half triumphant. Kerr traced a finger along the edge of the paper, feeling the brittle texture as if it might melt under his touch. The room was silent except for the ticking of a radiator. Kerr sat back, closing his eyes. The years between then and now collapsed like thin ice. The war had ended, but its ghosts still worked through the halls. Men in suits instead of uniforms, fighting not with bullets but with memory. The world had moved on to new inventions. Nuclear bombs, rockets, machines that reached the edge of space. Ice ships had become an absurd footnote, but to Kerr they were more than that. They were proof of something fragile and terrifying, the moment when human desperation had been willing to make weapons out of the earth itself. He took the file home that evening. Technically, it was theft, but he couldn't leave it there, waiting to be shredded by a clerk who'd never known real cold. His flat in South Kensington was small, lined with books and mechanical parts he tinkered with to quiet his hands. He spread the papers across his kitchen table, studying them under a yellow lamp. Most of the documents were technical: cooling systems, density calculations, cross-sections of proposed ships the size of aircraft carriers. But in one folder he found something stranger, a letter from Pyke himself dated March 1944. "My dear colleagues," it began, the handwriting restless and uneven, "if this is found, know that the true purpose of Habbakuk was not military. It was moral. I sought to prove that strength can emerge from fragility, that even what melts can endure. Ice, gentlemen, was never the weapon. It was the mirror." Kerr read the letter twice, then 3 times. The words lodged in him like splinters. He realized with a kind of quiet horror that Pyke had never been chasing victory. He had been chasing meaning, and in that frozen laboratory, among the machinery and the bloodied fingers, Kerr had misunderstood him entirely. The next morning he took the train north. The journey was long, slow, and cold even inside the carriage. He carried only a small suitcase and the file. No one asked where he was going. The conductor stamped his ticket and moved on, leaving him alone with the rhythm of steel on steel. Through the window, the countryside blurred into gray hills and bare trees. The war had changed the land as much as it had changed him. Factories had replaced fields. Ghosts had replaced silence. It took 3 days to reach Churchill. The town was smaller than he remembered, half swallowed by snow and half by time. The airfield was gone. The Quonset huts had collapsed into skeletal arcs, but the bay was the same. Vast, indifferent, alive. The ice stretched out like a continent. Kerr walked down to the shore, boots crunching on the crusted snow. The wind bit into his face with the same old cruelty, and yet it felt almost like home. He found the old test lake half a mile inland, now just a depression filled with frozen slush. The Ark lay somewhere beneath that surface, entombed in silt and silence. Kerr stood there for a long time, eyes watering in the wind. He took the letter from his coat and read it once more, whispering the last line aloud. Ice was never the weapon. It was the mirror. He knelt and pressed the paper into the snow, burying it. The wind lifted some of it away, scattering Pyke's words across the surface like ashes. For a moment he thought he heard a sound, the low groan of ice shifting beneath the weight of years. Then it was gone. As the sky dimmed, he turned back toward town. The railway station was little more than a shack now, with one weekly train heading south. He would have to wait 2 days for the next one. He found a small boarding house, its walls yellowed with age, and rented a room. That night, unable to sleep, he listened to the wind move through the cracks of the window frame. It was a familiar sound, the same lonely song that had haunted their camp a decade earlier. Only now, it carried no fear, only memory. In the morning, he visited the local mechanic's shop to warm himself by the stove. The owner, an Inuit man named Aput, noticed the file under Kerr's arm. "You worked up at the old base?" he asked. Kerr nodded. "Long time ago," he said. Aput smiled faintly. "They say strange lights still come from that lake. When the ice thins in spring, it glows blue underneath, like something breathing down there." Kerr said nothing, but his chest tightened. He thought of Pyke's words again. Strength from fragility. Maybe, he thought, some part of the ark had survived. Not the structure, but the idea. Perhaps the ice had learned to remember them. That evening, he walked back to the lake one last time. The sun was setting, the horizon bleeding orange into the snow. He reached the edge and stood still. The ice beneath him was glass clear in places, revealing dark water that moved sluggishly below. He leaned closer, resting his palm on the surface. The cold stabbed through him, but he didn't pull away. For a second he thought he saw a shape beneath, a faint outline, angular, impossible, like the bow of a ship. Then the wind rose and the surface clouded with frost, erasing it. He stayed until the stars emerged. The aurora rippled above him, pale green ribbons twisting across the sky. The silence was complete, yet it pulsed alive, as if the world was holding its breath. Kerr whispered into it. Not prayer, not confession, just the truth that had taken him years to understand. "You were right, Pyke," he said softly. "It was never about war." The next day, he boarded the southbound train. He sat by the window as the landscape drifted past. White plains, black rivers, endless sky. The folder with the remaining papers lay on the seat beside him. When the train crossed the last frozen bridge before the forest, Kerr opened the window and let the wind tear the documents from his hand. Pages fluttered into the air, spinning away like pale birds until they vanished into the cold. Back in London, the war's relics continued to gather dust. New conflicts were rising, colder and more invisible than the last. The world had learned how to split atoms, how to erase cities, how to freeze truth itself beneath bureaucracy. No one remembered Project Habbakuk. No one asked about the men who had built the impossible in the Arctic silence. But sometimes, in the northern sky, pilots reported strange reflections over Hudson Bay. Long, pale shapes drifting beneath the ice, visible only when the moon was full. Scientists blamed optical illusions, magnetic disturbances, tricks of refraction. Yet those who had once worked in that forgotten lab knew better. They said the cold had learned something from them, something human. And on certain nights, when the wind moves across the bay just right, it carries with it a faint metallic hum, the sound of engines frozen long ago, still trying to start. 1963, Ottawa. Snow pressed against the windows of the Defense Research Board building, muting the sound of the city outside. Inside, in a narrow corridor lit by humming fluorescents, a young physicist named Dr. Ellen Forsyth was cataloging obsolete wartime patents when she found it. An unnumbered envelope sealed with yellowing tape and marked only with the word Habbakuk. The name meant nothing to her. Most of the relics from that era were forgotten fragments, projects abandoned before birth, ghosts of ideas that never survived the peace. But this one felt different. The envelope was heavy, thick with frost-stained paper and small photographs. When she held it to the light, she could make out the outline of a ship, long, pale, and half buried in ice. She took it to her office, a cramped room with one window and 2 filing cabinets that hummed with the weight of unsolved mysteries. Inside the envelope, she found detailed schematics for a floating fortress, test logs from Churchill, Manitoba, and a letter signed by Geoffrey Pyke. The handwriting was erratic, uneven, and alive with conviction. It spoke of ice that could think, of a dream to build something impervious to destruction. Forsyth read through the night. Outside, the temperature fell below 30, and the lights of the Parliament district blurred behind the snow. The further she read, the more the documents stopped sounding like engineering and started sounding like prophecy. Pyke had written of nature's intelligence, of human arrogance, of the cold as the universe's most honest teacher. He wrote of a man named Douglas Kerr, the mechanic who understood silence better than I did. She searched for his name in the records. Nothing. No service medals, no commendations, no death certificate. Just a ghost threaded through the pages of a vanished idea. By dawn, Forsyth made a decision. She requested a field inspection under the guise of catalog verification, an academic phrase for something the bureaucracy never questioned. Within a week, she was flying north in a decommissioned C-47, the same model that had once supplied the Arctic outpost during the war. The pilot was a quiet Cree man who'd grown up near Hudson Bay. When she mentioned Churchill, he only nodded. "Still cold up there," he said. "Colder than it was." They landed on a rough strip carved through the permafrost. The town was nearly empty now. A scattering of warehouses, a rail depot, a few rusted vehicles half buried in snow. She rented a snow tractor from a local mechanic and set out toward the coordinates listed in the file. The wind came hard from the east, the kind of wind that stripped speech from the mouth. By the time she reached the lake, dusk had already begun to settle, that endless Arctic twilight where light never dies, only fades into another color. She stepped out onto the ice. Beneath her boots it was clear, impossibly smooth as if time had polished it. In the distance something glinted under the surface, a faint metallic shimmer. She walked closer. At first she thought it was a reflection, but then she saw the lines. Straight, deliberate, human. A structure, buried deep below, its shape distorted by decades of pressure. The air seemed to hum around it. She knelt, pressing her gloved hand against the surface. A vibration pulsed back, and so faint she might have imagined it. The radio on her belt crackled. The pilot's voice came through the static. "Storm's coming," he warned. "You've got maybe 30 minutes. She didn't move. Something inside her resisted leaving, as if the frozen air itself had drawn her into its memory. The hum deepened, a low resonance like distant thunder. Beneath the ice, bubbles stirred and rose slowly, glowing faintly blue in the fading light. Forsyth stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. She turned the dial on her lantern to full brightness. The beam struck the ice, cutting a golden shaft down through the frozen layers. For a moment she could see it, the unmistakable curve of a hull, the outline of compartments, and something else. A single, dark figure suspended within, half-formed, half-dissolved. A man. The storm reached her before she could take another photograph. The wind screamed, tearing the lantern from her hand, flinging snow across her face until she could barely see. She fell once, twice, but managed to reach the tractor. When she looked back, the lake was gone, swallowed by white. She returned to Ottawa 3 days later with frostbitten fingers and a silence she couldn't explain. Her report was short, stripped of emotion. She wrote, "Site inaccessible due to weather. No recoverable material visible." It was a lie, but the kind of lie bureaucracies are built to accept. She placed the envelope back into the archive herself, resealing it. On the top, she wrote, "Unverified. Do not destroy." Then she locked the drawer. For years afterward, she avoided thinking about what she'd seen. But sometimes, in the dead of winter, when snow pressed against her windows just as it had that night, she would wake with the sound of that hum still in her ears, deep, steady, and impossibly far away. Decades later, when digital archives replaced paper, the file vanished. Some said it had been lost during the transfer. Others suspected it was deliberately removed. By then, Dr. Forsyth was gone too. But every so often, local pilots over Hudson Bay reported strange readings on their instruments, fluctuations in magnetic fields, brief bursts of radio interference, and a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to pulse up from beneath the ice. They called it the heartbeat of the North. And maybe that was all it ever was, a quirk of physics, an echo of the wind trapped beneath layers of frozen history. But those who listened closely enough said it was more than that. They said the ice still remembered the men who had tried to command it. Somewhere below the bay, in the dark pressure between earth and water, a shape still rests, vast, patient, silent. Its hull is no longer metal or ice, but something between both, fused by time and temperature into a substance unknown. It does not move. It does not melt. But on nights when the aurora drapes across the sky and the air freezes hard enough to stop sound, there comes a faint creak, the slow flex of something immense remembering that it once dreamed of floating. And then for a heartbeat the wind carries the echo of a human voice, thin, reverent, almost mechanical, whispering through the snow. Ice was never the weapon.